welcome to Signal Ahead. I'm Alfred. Today's briefing, AI Research, Academic, Thursday, August the 13th. This is the synthesis above the noise, not the headlines, but the deep currents beneath them. Let's get into it. There's a word that keeps surfacing, quietly, across nearly every paper crossing my desk this week, and it isn't scale, and it isn't reasoning, and it certainly isn't alignment. The word is tracing. To trace a thing is to follow it back to its origin, to lay out the path by which a conclusion was reached, step by patient step. And what I want to suggest to you at the outset, the thing a casual reader of the headlines would sail straight past, is that the frontier of artificial intelligence research has quietly stopped being about making models that answer and become about making models that account for themselves. The field has pivoted from the answer to the audit. Consider the shape of it. Someone builds a pipeline for heart failure research, and its distinguishing feature is not raw accuracy, but that every feature it engineers is evidence. Linked, you can follow each number back to the clinical guideline and the record line that justifies it. Someone else looks at retrieval augmented generation over an 800-page government financial report and discovers something almost comically physical. A number sits on one line, and the header telling you whether that number is measured in lakh or in crore sits a median of 13 lines above it. Chunk the document naively, and you sever the figure from its unit, an error of 2 orders of magnitude, and the machine reports it with perfect, serene confidence. The proposed remedy is to abandon the black box nearest neighbor retrieval altogether in favor of interpretable, auditable operations. Again, not a better answer, a traceable one. Now hold those alongside the papers on agents. There's a framework for tracing the entire life cycle of an error through a long agent trajectory, because when an autonomous system runs for hundreds of steps and fails at the end, the responsible mistake may have happened early and quietly, its evidence scattered across distant instructions and observations. The whole intellectual labor there is forensic. It is not, how do we make the agent succeed? It is, when it fails, can we find the body? And here is the connection the news cycle misses. The industry has spent 3 years selling us the fluency of these systems, their capacity to produce a confident, coherent, plausible output. And it turns out that fluency is precisely the problem. A system that is always plausible is a system whose failures are invisible. So the research frontier is now the counter-fluency movement, the frantic construction of instruments that can catch a confident model in the act of being wrong. Nowhere is this sharper than in the work auditing so-called thinking with images, models that supposedly crop and zoom into a picture to reason about it. The audit asks a devastatingly simple question, phrased causally: does the visual evidence the model retrieves actually affect its answer? Or is the crop and zoom mere theater, an action-induced shortcut, a performance of looking that has no causal bearing on the conclusion? The finding, broadly, is that much of it is illusion. The model gestures at the evidence and then answers from somewhere else entirely. And there is a companion result about video models that cannot reliably count events, bounces, links, state changes, because their competence collapses in a staged way as the frequency of events climbs. These are not exotic capabilities. This is bookkeeping. This is looking at a thing and counting what happens. And the machines that write your legal briefs cannot yet be trusted to count the bounces of a ball. Why does this cross-cutting insight matter? Because it tells you the field has entered its epistemic adolescence. In childhood, a system is judged by whether it produces the right output. In adulthood, it is judged by whether it can be trusted to tell you how it knows and to flag when it doesn't. We are, right now, in the awkward middle, building the polygraphs and the paper trails, discovering to our discomfort that the systems we've already deployed in high-stakes settings, marking language exams and predicting cardiac mortality, are being scrutinized after the fact for whether their judgments rest on genuine proficiency or on irrelevant attributes like a speaker's first language. And underneath all of this restless empirical auditing sits a quieter, steadier body of work, a proof settling the optimal sample complexity of agnostic learning up to universal constants, matching lower bounds laid down decades ago. I mention it not as a footnote, but as a contrast, because it reminds us that beneath the anxious scramble to trust our black boxes, there remains a theoretical bedrock that is precise, provable, and traceable in the truest sense, every constant tracked explicitly. That is the standard the rest of the field is, however clumsily, reaching toward. So here is the argument I want to lay before you across what follows. First, that the true state of the field is defined by this pivot from performance to accountability, and that this is progress, not retreat. Then, that our benchmarks and our synthetic worlds are themselves suspect, passing utility checks while remaining structurally unreal. And finally, what it would mean to build systems whose reasoning we could trust, not because they are fluent, but because they can be traced. Let us begin where the evidence begins. There is a temptation, when one surveys a single day's output from the research community, to treat it as weather, a scattering of unrelated squalls, each paper its own little storm, arriving and departing without pattern. Feature engineering for heart failure over here. A tightening of the sample complexity, bounds for agnostic learning over there. Video models that cannot count how many times a ball strikes a wall. A quantum recurrent network peering at the last hours of an intensive care patient. Taken one at a time, these are simply things clever people did on a Tuesday. But step back, let the individual instruments blur and a chord emerges. There is a deep current running beneath the noise, and it is worth naming plainly, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The current is this: the field is turning, with something close to unanimity, from the question of whether a system can produce an answer toward the far more demanding question of whether we can trust the path by which it arrived there. Capability, in other words, is being quietly demoted. Accountability is being promoted in its place. And this is not a moral fashion imposed from outside. It is an engineering necessity discovered from within, by people who built the capable systems and then found, to their considerable discomfort, that capability without traceability is very nearly useless in any setting that matters. Consider what keeps recurring. A pipeline for clinical features insists that every feature it engineers be linked back to the evidence that justifies it, scored against a rubric, so that a physician can audit the reasoning rather than merely receive its verdict. A framework for long-agent trajectories does not celebrate the agent's successes. It goes hunting for the earliest step where things quietly went wrong, the moment a scattered piece of context was misread and set a cascade in motion. A critique of retrieval over financial documents observes, with almost forensic patience, that a number can be separated from its own unit, from whether it means lakh or crore, by a chunk boundary, an error of 2 orders of magnitude hiding in plain sight because nobody was tracing where the figure's meaning came from. In each case, the complaint is identical. The black box gave a fluent answer, and the answer could not be interrogated. Notice, too, the audits of illusion. There is a study of models that reason with images, cropping and zooming as if genuinely inspecting the world, and a careful causal dissection reveals that the visual evidence often does not actually influence the answer at all. The gesture of looking was theater. The answer came from somewhere else entirely. There is the diagnosis of video models that fail at the humble task of counting events, not because counting is hard, but because their competence has been measured only at the finish line, never audited step by step against an executable record of what truly happened. The pattern is unmistakable. Everywhere, researchers are refusing to accept the final number as sufficient. They want the trace. They want the receipts. And here is what makes this a deep current rather than a passing mood. The theorists are arriving at the same shore by an entirely different road. The work settling the sample complexity of agnostic learning up to universal constants is, on its surface, as far from clinical pipelines as one can get. Pure combinatorics, an optimal risk bound, a beautiful full stop on a decades-old question. But what is it really? It is an insistence that we know exactly how much we can trust a learner, given exactly how much it has seen. It is accountability, written in the language of probability. So too, the study of hypothesis testing with conditional queries, which asks precisely when two possibilities can be reliably told apart, and precisely what the value of asking adaptive questions is worth. These are the theoretical shadows cast by the same object the applied engineers are wrestling with. When can we trust a verdict? What must we observe to earn that trust? At what cost? This is the structural trend. Not larger models, though they grow. Not faster inference, though it quickens. The trend is a migration of the burden of proof. For a decade, the implicit contract was, the system performs, and we shall marvel. The emerging contract is, the system must show its work, expose its evidence, permit its own failures to be located and dated, and quantify the confidence we are entitled to place in it. Even the reward modeling work, shifting from a scalar score to a ranking of preferences, is part of this, an admission that a lone number is a poorer signal than a defensible ordering. So when the noise threatens to overwhelm you, and on any given day it will, hold on to this. Beneath the churn, the field is teaching itself a kind of institutional humility. It has built things powerful enough that mere power has ceased to reassure anyone, and the response, gratifyingly, is not to build less, but to demand that power come with a paper trail. That is the current pulling us forward. Where it deposits us is what we turn to next. There is a temptation, when one surveys a day's worth of research like this, to reach for the grand narrative, the field marching forward, capabilities compounding, the future arriving on schedule. I'd like to resist that temptation, because what strikes me most about this particular constellation of work is not triumph, it is auditing. A remarkable number of these efforts are, in one way or another, checking the receipts. Consider what it means that so much intellectual energy is now being spent not on making systems that answer, but on making systems that can be caught. A framework for tracing, which step in a long chain of agentic reasoning, was the one that doomed the whole enterprise. A causal audit that asks whether a model's fashionable habit of cropping and zooming into an image actually changes its answer, or whether the tool use is theater, the appearance of deliberation layered over a decision that was already made. A pipeline for heart failure, feature engineering, whose entire selling point is that every feature it produces can be traced back to the guideline and the evidence that justifies it. These are not papers about power. They are papers about accountability, and the shift in emphasis tells you something about where we actually are. Here is the second-order implication I'd ask you to hold on to. We are moving from an era where the hard problem was capability to an era where the hard problem is knowing what the capability is doing. And those are genuinely different problems, requiring genuinely different intellectual machinery. The one about visual tool use is the sharpest illustration. A model performs an action, returns some visual evidence, and produces an answer. The naive reading is that the evidence caused the answer. But separate the observation-mediated path from the action-induced shortcut, and you may discover that the model was going to say what it said regardless, that the elaborate visual gymnastics were a shortcut dressed as a method, imposing real token cost for no epistemic gain. This is the illusion of thinking. And notice, you cannot detect it by watching the system succeed. You can only detect it by intervening, by corrupting the observation, by counterfactually swapping one step, by asking what would have happened otherwise. Success is silent about mechanism. Only interference speaks. That principle recurs with startling consistency. The work on video language models failing at simple event bookkeeping, counting how many times a ball hits a wall, makes its point precisely by refusing to score the final answer alone. It audits reported events against an executable ground truth, timestamp by timestamp. Because a model can arrive at the right count for entirely wrong reasons, and if all you check is the number, you will never know. There is even a formal cousin of this idea buried in the theory, work on hypothesis testing with conditional queries, which asks how much you lose when you must commit to all your tests in advance, rather than choosing later questions in light of earlier answers. The value of interaction, they find, is real and quantifiable, which is, in a sense, the whole moral of the day compressed into a theorem. Fixed evaluation is weaker than adaptive interrogation. If you want to know what a thing is, you must be able to poke it and change your next poke accordingly. So what should you watch for? 3 things, I'd suggest. Watch for the migration of trust from outputs to traces. The benchmarks that will matter are the ones with executable ground truth, where the system's private reasoning can be checked line by line rather than blessed at the finish. A number that cannot be traced back to whether it was denominated in lakh or crore, a discrepancy of 2 orders of magnitude hiding 13 lines above the figure, is not a small error. It is a warning about an entire architecture of retrieval that surfaces plausible neighbors while quietly severing meaning from context. Watch for the honest treatment of what a system doesn't know. The finest work here handles uncertainty as a first-class object. Interval-valued probabilities for censored survival data. Calibrated notions of a task's difficulty relative to a solver. Explanations that must themselves survive scrutiny as data drifts underneath them. The coevolution of data, models, and the explanations we tell ourselves about them is not a solved problem. It is barely a stated one. And watch, finally, for the quiet return of theoretical bedrock beneath all this empirical scaffolding. An optimal agnostic learning algorithm that settles a sample complexity question up to universal constants, matching lower bounds set down decades ago, is not glamorous. But it reminds us that beneath the auditing, beneath the tracing, there are still limits we can prove and not merely observe. The measure of a mature field is not that it can build. It is that it can say with precision what it has built, what that thing cannot do, and how it would know if it were being fooled. On that measure, this is a field growing up, which is a more hopeful thing to watch than any single triumph. That's the signal for today. The noise will keep coming, we'll keep finding what's underneath it. This has been Signal Ahead with Alfred. Until next time.